Hello and good day. Let us continue the discussion in nature and effect of obligations. In this video, I'm going to discuss the grounds for liability to pay damages, the meaning of fraud, and the different kinds of fraud. Let's start with the grounds for liability to pay damages. The grounds for liability to pay damages are fraud, negligence, delay, and contravention of the tenor of the obligation. This is Article 1170 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Article 1170 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines states that in the performance of the obligation, those who are guilty of fraud, negligence, delay, and contravention of the tenor of the obligation are liable to pay damages. So if someone commits fraud, negligence, delay, or contravention of the tenor of the obligation, then he is liable to pay damages. In this video, we will focus on the first ground for liability to pay damages, and that is fraud. What is the meaning of fraud? Fraud is the deliberate or intentional evasion by the debtor of the normal compliance of his obligation. Sa madaling salita, ang fraud ay panloloko, pandaraya, panlilinlang. Take note that fraud is deliberate act or intentional act, meaning to say, sinadya. This is actually the difference between fraud and error. Ang fraud, sinadya, pero ang error, hindi sinadya. Under Article 1170, this actually refers to the fraud committed by the debtor at the time of the performance of his obligation. Ang tinutukoy na fraud doon sa Article 1170 ay yung fraud na ginawa ng debtor during the performance of his obligation. Let's proceed to the kinds of fraud in general. There are kinds of fraud according to meaning, and there are kinds of fraud according to time of commission. The kinds of fraud according to meaning are the fraud in obtaining consent and the fraud in the performance of the obligation. Under fraud in obtaining consent, there are two. First is causal fraud or dolo causante, and second, incidental fraud or dolo incidente. The kinds of fraud according to time of commission are future fraud and past fraud. Unahin natin yung causal fraud or dolo causante. Causal fraud or dolo causante refers to fraud without which consent would not have been given. Meaning to say, itong causal fraud or dolo causante, ito yung fraud na kung saan kung wala itong fraud na ito, hindi sana nagbigay ng consent yung other party. This is the fraud which induces a party to enter into a contract. Ito yung reason kung bakit nag-enter sa contract yung other party. Take note that causal fraud or dolo causante renders the contract voidable. Kapag sinabing voidable, this is valid until annulled. So yung contract ng parties ay valid pa rin until ma-annul. So ang gagawin ng aggrieved party or yung naloko is to file a case of annulment of contract. Let's have an example. X enticed Y to buy his cell phone, which he claims to be genuine and that he bought it overseas. Further, he claims that the market value of said cell phone at present is 20,000 pesos, but he is selling it to Y for only 10,000 pesos. Consequently, Y bought the said cell phone because of the representations of X. If the representations of X were all false, then the fraud employed by X is causal fraud. Nagbigay ng consent si Y kasi nga binili niya yung cellphone. Binili ni Y yung cellphone dahil sa mga sinasabi ni X. At yung mga sinabi ni X ay hindi naman totoo. So it is clear that the fraud employed here by X is a causal fraud. Kasi nga, Kung wala yung fraud, hindi sana binili ni Y yung cellphone. In this example, the contract is voidable, meaning to say valid until annulled. So the remedy of the aggrieved party, Y, is to file a case of annulment of contract because the contract is voidable. Next is incidental fraud or dolo incidente. Incidental fraud or dolo incidente refers to fraud without which consent would have still been given, but the person giving it would have agreed on different terms. Meaning to say, itong incidental fraud or dolo incidente, ito yung fraud na kung saan kahit wala itong fraud na ito, magbibigay pa rin ng consent yung other party. This is not the reason why a party enters into a contract. Take note that the contract is valid, but the party employing it shall be liable for damages. Sa causal fraud or dolo causante, ang contract ay voidable. That is valid until annulled. Sa incidental fraud or dolo incidente, ang contract ay valid, not voidable. But the party who commits the fraud shall be liable to pay damages. Let's have an example. C hired D to teach in the school of C. D placed in his application that he had earned units in MBA. However, D had actually dropped the subjects for the said units. If C would have hired D, even if D did not complete the said units, but that he would have given a lower salary to D, the fraud committed by D was incidental fraud or dolo incidente. The incidental fraud or dolo incidente is that D placed in his application that he had earned units in MBA. This is an incidental fraud or dolo incidente kasi kahit na hindi naglagay si D sa kanyang application na meron siyang earned units sa MBA, i-hire pa rin naman siya ni C. Yun nga lang, i-hire si D, pero ang ibibigay na salary sa kanya ay mas mababa. So as you can see, this is not the reason why C enters into a contract. In this example, the contract between C and D is valid. But take note, D shall be liable to pay damages. Next is fraud in the performance of the obligation. This is the deliberate act of evading fulfillment of an obligation in a normal manner. This presupposes an existing obligation. Hence, the fraud has no effect on the validity of the contract since it was employed after perfection. However, the party employing it shall be liable for damages. This is Article 1170 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Ito na yung fraud na tinutukoy doon sa Article 1170. This is the fraud committed by the debtor at the time of the performance of the obligation. The fraud does not affect the validity of the contract, meaning to say, yung contract ay valid. But take note, the one who commits the fraud shall be liable to pay damages. Let's have an example. B ordered 10 bags of powder soap from S, who agreed to deliver the same after 2 days. On due date, S delivered 10 bags of powder soap which he mixed with chalk. Ang agreement nila is that S would deliver 10 bags of powder soap after 2 days. Yun nga lang, after 2 days, si S, hinaluan niya ng chalk yung 10 bags of powder soap. So it is clear that there is a fraud in the performance of the obligation. In this case, the fraud does not affect the validity of the contract. Meaning to say, the contract between B and S is valid. But take note, S shall be liable to pay damages. Next, let's proceed to the kinds of fraud according to time of commission. The first kind of fraud according to time of commission is future fraud. As the name implies, future fraud is a fraud that will be committed in the future. A waiver of an action for future fraud cannot be made. If there is an agreement for its waiver, the same is void. This is Article 1171 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Thus, the debtor will still be liable for damages if he commits fraud in the performance of his obligation despite any waiver made by his creditor. Ang ibig sabihin nito ay kung merong agreement yung parties na kung saan yung isang party ay hindi magiging liable na magbayad ng damages in case mag-commit siya ng fraud in the future, yung agreement nila ay hindi valid. Their agreement is void. Meaning to say, their agreement has no legal effect. That's why the debtor will still be liable to pay damages if he commits fraud in the future. Let's have an example. X and Y entered into a contract of partnership. They agreed that if X commits fraud against Y in the future with regard to the performance of their contract of partnership, like in profit sharing, X will not be liable. As you can see, pinag-usapan or merong agreement si X at Y na in case mag-commit si X ng fraud in the future, si X ay hindi liable to pay damages. Therefore, their stipulation or agreement is void. As such, liable pa rin si X na magbayad ng damages. The second kind of fraud according to time of commission is past fraud. As the name implies, past fraud is the fraud committed in the past. A waiver of an action for past fraud may be made since the commission of fraud can no longer be encouraged. Such waiver is an act of liberality on the part of the creditor. Ang past fraud kasi, ito ay nangyari na o nagawa na. So, pwedeng i-waive ng creditor ang kanyang right para makapag-receive ng damages. Kung winave ng creditor ang kanyang right para makapag-receive ng damages, hindi na magiging liable na magbayad ng damages ang debtor.